welcome to my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos on Vedic astrology mainly, but also with some tropical insights. And I focus on both relationship and natal astrology. And if you like this video and you would like to see more content from me, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, I do consultations on a wide variety of topics. You can check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. You can email me for further details about readings and reading options. And also, if you are interested in becoming a member, I have membership options. You can find out more information by clicking on the join button next to basically every video that I've posted. There's a join button, and if you click on it, you can find out more details about the membership options and which of these 3 types of memberships might be suitable to you. And also, last but not least, I have a tarot channel, so if you're interested in tarot, go ahead and check it out. Maybe subscribe. I will be linking it in the video description as well as in the pinned comment. All right, thank you. So today's topic is going to be on something that I have mentioned in the community post a while ago, and it's going to be about the negative expression of Saturn archetypes. Before I get into it, some of you may remember that I have done a video a while ago where I talked about Jupiter's negative archetypes, or the dark side of Jupiter. If you're curious, I'm going to also be linking that video in the video description together with any relevant videos that you might be interested in pertaining to this topic. So check the video description if you're curious. And what I wanted to say was that this is kind of a disclaimer by me saying that I'm not going to bash people who have prominent Saturn placements. I want to say this as usual, that every planetary archetype and every astrological archetype, whether it's the archetype of a planet or a sign or a nakshatra, has positive and negative sides. All right, so this is not me saying that people who have prominent Saturn placements are all bad, or that they will all express these negative traits. It depends on a lot of other individual placements within individual horoscopes, because you have to look at the big picture. It's really difficult in astrology to draw conclusions based on, just 1 or 2 placements. You have to look at the whole thing. That being said, though, I will be mentioning some of the most common negative expressions that I have seen connected to the archetype of Saturn that is most prominently seen in people who have prominent Saturn placements. So prominent Saturn placements means people who have Saturn conjunct a lot of planets, especially if Saturn is conjunct the moon or the ascendant or the sun, because these are the most important single configurations that determine a person's personality, especially the moon, because the moon represents the mind. It represents the basic personality of a person. So especially Vedic astrology, as by comparison to tropical astrology, is very moon focused, very moon dominant, as opposed to tropical, which is more about the sun, right? It's more sun dominant. And yeah, so these would be the most prominent placements. And then, of course, a lot of placements of planets in nakshatras ruled by Saturn, which are Pushya, Uttara Bhadrapada, and Anuradha. So a lot of placements in these Saturn-dominant nakshatras will also make a person very Saturnian. And again, you can look at the D1, you can look at the D9. And last but not least, equally important, you want to look at house placements, right? Is Saturn prominently placed in the horoscope? Especially if Saturn is in the 1st, 7th house axis, then the person's personality is going to be very much Saturnian. And you can look at this also in the Navamsa. And in the Navamsa, especially if Saturn is in the 1st, 5th, or 9th houses, it can definitely affect the way that they view the world and color the views and their beliefs and everything, the way that they view the world through a very Saturnian flavor, everything about fear and survival and all that, and also very, very high focus on practicality and materialism. sometimes at the expense of other more meaningful things in life. But I'm going to get more into detail as I progress. And you can also look at house placements when taken from the moon. I have mentioned this also in other videos, that you can look at the moon sign as an ascendant, and especially for people who have the moon sign in a lower degree than the ascendant. Sometimes the moon ascendant or the moon sign and looking at the planets from the moon sign can actually give more insights, especially with respect to what makes them happy, their basic personality, their mentalities, but also when it comes to transits, planetary transits. I have talked about this in my series where I did transits for every sign for 2023, 2022, and so on. Yeah. So you also want to look at it from the moon sign. Is Saturn, especially in the 1st, 7th house axis, but also in the other Kendra houses, the 4th and the 10th house, that will make it very strong. Again, if it is conjunct, again, with more important planets, especially also if it's conjunct with the Lagna Lord, right? It's also particularly strong, or even if it's aspecting the Lagna Lord to some extent, but I would say conjunctions are the strongest here. And yeah, so these are the main placements that I would look at to determine whether a person is Saturnian, or has a strong Saturn placement. So, what are the general negative traits of these people? First of all, let me get into what Saturn stands for. All right, so Saturn is about limitations. It's about the limitations of the material world, whether they are perceived or real, actually. And I mean, I'm talking about fears here. I'm talking about people being confronted with obstacles and limitations. This is why Saturn also rules disease, obstacles, frustrations, anything that takes a long time to get over or progress through is basically ruled by Saturn. Anything like chronic illness, for instance, is very Saturn. Just anything, anything that has a long duration for you to progress through whatever this is, that's basically Saturn. Saturn is, in a sense, meant to test our commitment, right? It's also why Saturn is connected to commitment in general. And I have done videos where I talked about how Saturn plays out in synastry or relationship dynamics. And again, I will try to link those in the video description if you want to find out more about them. With respect to positives as well as negatives, what a lot of Saturn conjunctions and aspects in synastry could point out to. And Saturn, yeah, it is about things that will stand the test of time. This is why Saturn is sometimes even connected to time itself. It's also connected to death to some extent, and longevity or lack of longevity. It's also ruling the skeletal structure. It's ruling minerals. It's ruling stones, and basically rocks and everything that is just bare minimum but solid. And in the world, this is what it rules. And also it rules areas that are not very favorable to life. Like very cold places like Antarctica, or deserts, or places that are quite barren, where there isn't a lot of vegetation. They're not particularly hospitable to human life, for instance. All of these things are ruled by Saturn. So, and Saturn, last but not least, very importantly, is connected to the archetype of the old man or the old woman. And in fact, traditionally, it's connected to the old woman. This is why Saturn and Mercury are the two planets that are kind of seen as genderless in Vedic astrology. And it's not actually because they are completely genderless, because Saturn is more of a feminine energy, Mercury is more of a masculine energy. But the reason why they're seen as a little bit androgynous is because Saturn rules a very old person, so when people get to that really old stage in life, they no longer care that much about sexuality, right? So they're not as highly, how should I put it? They're not as highly defined by their gender as a young person, right? If you think of an old man, old woman, they're generally not out there, interested in affairs and passionate and all this stuff. This is why Saturn is connected to, conserving energy and dealing with how to make the most of the resources you have available. It's the archetype of the old woman, like, or the old person who, let's say, doesn't have as much time left, doesn't have as many resources left. So they are somehow forced to work hard to make the most of what they have. This is why Saturn, I mean, I'm going to get more into this as I progress. But in my observation, actually, not just perception, Saturn oftentimes leads to people who are deceptive, leads to people acting deceptively because they are functioning from this mentality of the person who is old, even when they're not old, right? Even when they're really young, these people who are very Saturn dominant, they embody this energy, right? They don't want to, often you will see that Saturnians don't like to get into conflicts, for instance, especially not open conflicts. But that doesn't mean that they're actually pro-peace. Instead, what they often do is they manipulate others to do the dirty work for them while they get to preserve their energy. And you see this a lot with politicians, for instance. I mean, to some extent, this is, of course, a general psychological pattern. I mean, you don't even have to look at it from the astrological perspective to see that this is happening in the world. But a lot of the times when you look at even some of these politicians that are very sly and very manipulative, you will see strong Saturn placements. And I've talked about this again in multiple videos, especially the left-leaning politicians tend to be Saturn dominant. And again, I'm going to get more into this as I progress. So yes, Saturn rules this archetype of the old woman as opposed to Mercury, because I also mentioned Mercury, so let me just give 2 cents here about it, that Mercury rules the young person. Even though Mercury is a masculine planet, it rules kind of like that age range between late childhood, early puberty, when a young boy that is not really fully sexual yet. So there's this energy of androgyny about Mercury, and you often see this with people who have prominent Mercury energy, that they're kind of, not very prominently feminine or masculine in their energy. Of course, as usual, you do have to look at the full picture because you could have energies that overpower these energies, so you won't see them on the surface, or sometimes they won't even manifest within the person's psychological makeup at all, if there are other more prominent placements, all right? Just wanted to clear this out. So the negative impact of Saturn is coming from the psychology of Saturn. It's because a lot of the times these people, another thing, I have to make another parenthesis, is that Saturn also rules the poor people, the underprivileged. In traditional Vedic astrology, Saturn literally ruled beggars. And this is why I actually have heard this from, I'm pretty sure Kapil Raj said this, that if you want to look at a person who wants to be a good politician or a successful politician, oftentimes they have to have a prominent Saturn. Even when the person has, let's say, a dominant sun, a good Saturn shows that this person is able to successfully beg, quote unquote, for votes, And when you look at it, I mean, politicians and their, what is it called? The election season, right? It's basically a giant begging show. It's every politician vying for the votes of the electorate, and they're just doing whatever they can to convince the electorate that they should vote for them. So in a way, it's kind of like begging. You're begging the person for their vote, and because you're not literally offering a service. I mean, in theory, you are promising what you're going to be doing in the future, but you're not. It's not like when you're selling a service and you're expecting something in return. You're counting on this person's goodwill to act in your favor, So yes, Saturn rules the underprivileged, all right? It rules poverty because Saturn, again, rules hardships and it rules obstacles, and it also rules service. This is really important. Oftentimes people who have to work, a lot of backbreaking jobs for minimum wage, or they have to work a lot of physical, hardworking, repetitive work that is physical and doesn't require a huge amount of skill. or education often is shown by Saturn. So it also rules the night workers, for instance, people who work night shifts, you know. So basically any kind of job where you have to work really hard for your money is shown by Saturn, because again, Saturn is inherently connected to obstacles, frustrations, and hard work, just labor, toil, and all this stuff, right? So having all of these archetypes in view, when you see a person who has prominent Saturn, and I've seen this so many times, and I will be looking at a few examples at the end, especially when it is connected to the moon by conjunction, right? So bear in mind that in Vedic astrology, conjunction means that the two planets or placements or points are in the same sign, all right? So if you have, let's say, moon in 2 degrees Taurus and Saturn is in 29 degrees Taurus, that's still a conjunction, even though they're 27 degrees apart. It's true that the stronger the conjunction is, the tighter the orb is, the tighter the orb difference between the two planets or points, the stronger this conjunction is going to be felt. And of course, it also helps to look at which nakshatras they are placed in, because if the conjunction also happens in the same nakshatra, then it's that much more stronger, right? But in any case, the general rule is if the two planets are sharing the same sign, because automatically if they're sharing the same sign, according to Vedic astrology, they're also going to share the same house. Because again, Vedic astrology implies using the sidereal zodiac together with the whole sign house system, right? So they will be sharing the same area of life as well. That's what the house represents. So this means that these planets become intrinsically interconnected, and you especially see this with the moon, but to some extent, I mean, not to some extent, actually to a pretty great extent, you also see it when Saturn is conjunct other planets or even aspecting other planets, or you know, like I mentioned in the beginning, you know, all of those configurations. So you have a lot of placements in Saturn-ruled nakshatras, whether it's in the D1 or the D9. By the way, the D9, I would say, is equally important. And I mean, the D1 is the basis. It's kind of like the base tone of your life, but the D9 gets more into detail with respect to understanding your psyche. And remember also that the D9 especially shows how your life will progress, you know, after midlife or after marriage. All right. And what you see with these people who have a prominent Saturn placement is that they have this poverty consciousness oftentimes. Sometimes it's literally coming from their background, especially when you see, let's say, Saturn with the moon, conjunct the moon or aspecting the moon to a lesser extent, or whether Saturn is in the 4th house, which is the house of the home base, the mother. There's often actually literally a poverty there. Sometimes they come from an underprivileged background, or somehow early on in life, their class, their social position somehow was constantly being rubbed in their face. You know, they were compared to other people. Maybe sometimes it's not even like this person was dirt poor, but they were maybe had to go to school with kids who were wealthy, you know, and the kids who were wealthy constantly picked on them, or, you know, were wearing their expensive sneakers and whatever, like playing with their iPhones, last model, whatever, or they were driven to school by their wealthy parents in their fancy cars, and the kids would make fun of them or something. So there's that. Sometimes there's also the issue of being part of a minority, for instance, and feeling discriminated against, feeling like you are somehow below the rest of the population. Let's not also forget that Saturn rules, because Saturn rules actually fear and social norms, and also this is why Saturn rules orthodoxy. I've talked about this in multiple other videos, that people who are Saturn dominant, especially when you see Saturn with Jupiter, Saturn with, to some extent, Mercury, but especially Jupiter, you see people who are very much focused on doing things right, quote unquote, according to the social standards of their background. You know, oftentimes they cling to the traditions of their family even more than their families did. I know people who have Saturn dominant horoscopes who are born, let's say, into a particular religious background, but their parents were not even that religious, and they are the ones who choose to, you know, convert full time and commit to praying, I don't know, regularly and going to church or to temple or to whatever, So they're very focused on following rules and having a structure. And oftentimes they're also clinging to history, to tradition, to whatever it is that comes from their cultural background. But I digress a little bit here. In any case, there's also this element of Saturn that really all of these archetypes of Saturn kind of go hand in hand because it rules obstacles, because it rules frustrations, because it rules hardships. Oftentimes it shows that a person with prominent Saturn will go through all these things. And by the way, also another strong sign of a person who is Saturn dominant can be having Saturn as Atmakaraka or Amatyakaraka, or having Saturn conjunct the Atmakaraka. Remember, the Atmakaraka is the planet with the highest degree. And I've seen this with people who have Saturn as Atmakaraka, that they have very harsh lives. Oftentimes they go through a lot of struggles. Now, of course, whether this is enough for them to show the negative traits of Saturn, that is debatable. But I'm going to get more into it as I progress. Bear with me. So what I was going to say is also that because they come from this background of discrimination, of hardship, of, feeling like they're not fully included, right? Feeling like they have to work really hard for things that other people, as they see it, are just being given and other people may just take for granted. They develop this kind of resentment towards others, and it also gives them the mentality. Really the epitome of victim mentality, as you have seen it being discussed on social media, is very Saturnian. This mentality of, oh, I come from a poor background, or I come from this minority, or I come from, so-and-so, I'm a woman, and therefore I've been heavily discriminated. And I'm not trying to say that, of course, that people from minority classes or women or whatever, that discrimination doesn't exist. But I'm talking specifically about this mentality that somehow the world owes you something, because you were born in a underprivileged background. And furthermore, what I was really going to get at is the fact that oftentimes it leads Saturnians to think that they can cut corners, that they can deceive, that they can get a free pass at, behaving like a-holes sometimes, just because of the fact that they were discriminated against, or because they come from a underprivileged background. And you often see these people become extremely materialistic, later on in life. They focus, especially when you see Saturn in the first house or Saturn with the moon, these people can become super obsessed with just building a lot of wealth and a lot of materialism at the expense of other things, like off to the point of becoming very superficial. There is a reason also why Rahu is kind of connected to Saturn, because Rahu is, in a way, it's kind of like a chip off the old block, Rahu is kind of like the rebellious cousin of Saturn, or the rebellious child of Saturn, so to speak. But Rahu is also very much focused on materialism. But won't get into Rahu here. I might be talking about Rahu at some other point in the future. Sticking strictly to Saturn here, you often see this. This is the main thing that I wanted to say. They often use deception. And another thing is with them, when I say deception, I'm not talking about lying. In fact, these are masters of deception. These are people who can oftentimes dedicate their entire lives to projecting an image that is false. You often hear Saturnians, just like Rahuvians actually a lot of the times, but I would say even more so with Saturn, because Saturn, as opposed to Rahu, really looks at what the situation is. They very carefully analyze reality the way that it is right now. And this is also one of the reasons why I was going to mention this at some point as a critique on Teal Swan, because she talked about the acceptance of reality. And it makes sense that she would say that, because she herself is a very Saturn-dominant person, And, she has Saturn conjunct Mars, which is a pretty strong Saturnian placement. I haven't looked at her D9, but I wouldn't be surprised if I saw more there. In any case, so people who are very Saturn dominant, you actually often hear them say this, like, you need to accept things the way things are, right? They don't like to challenge the status quo, as opposed to Rahu, or as opposed to, let's say, even Mars, right? Because Mars is all about doing what you want by any means necessary. So a planet like Mars, for instance, is not going to be opposed to making waves in order to get what they want, and maybe even making a few enemies down the line. But the Saturnian dominants are very, very careful, bear in mind, because they have the mentality of the old person. They're very careful about preserving their energy. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at whatever is right now, the way it is, and think, how can I cut corners around every obstacle around, right? Instead of, let's say, so another thing is you're not going to see Saturnians, sparking heated debates, because they don't really have strong principles. They care about making it in the world the way that it is, right? So if you're a person, let's say, as opposed to, let's say, someone who's Mars dominant or Jupiter dominant, a Jupiter dominant person is going to have certain visions or certain ideals that they want to achieve, and everything else is kind of detailed, right? So they're not going to stop because society tells them to stop, right? Or they're not going to conform to social standards because that's what would mean, the least amount of effort for them or something. But with Saturnians, because they prioritize materialism, they just look at whatever is and how they can make things work in their favor, right? So they're not going to try to change the world if they think, well, what is the point of changing the world? Because I'm just going to waste a lot of energy. I'm going to make a lot of enemies. And at the end of the day, I may not get the comfort and the materialism and the power that I want, the control. Let's not forget that Saturn rules fear. And this is why I've talked about this in other videos, including, I'm pretty sure, the previous one I mentioned this. Saturnian mentalities are very much going hand in hand with narcissistic abuse and totalitarian regimes, because they are all about control and order, and because their motivation is, I want to feel safe. I want to have control so that I no longer have to fear anything, so that everything is predictable and I don't have to waste any more of my precious energy, time, and material resources. Again, always think about it. If you were an old person at the end of your, let's say you had another 5-10 good years to live, right? You wouldn't want to start a war right now and revolutionize the world. You would be just thinking, you know what, I am done. I am tired with this shit, I just want to enjoy myself as much as possible for the time that I have left. I'm not trying to change the world here, That's the kind of mentality that Saturnians have. And then because they are so driven by fear and this consciousness of limitation and lack, they're very focused on control and gaining power and materialism, because they think that if they get those things, they're going to feel safe, right? It's all about safety, all right, with Saturn. It's all about preservation, self-preservation, whatever you call it, whatever you want to call it. But mainly about preserving energy and resources. That's what it is. So where did I even start with this? Hold on. Yeah, the idea that Saturnians can be deceptive. That's pretty much the main thing that I wanted to say. And like I said, they're very good at basically, this is something that I've noticed time and time again. If you are interested in the topic of narcissism and narcissistic abuse, you will see that Saturnians are very good at what psychologists call gray rocking. And if you are not familiar with the term, very quickly, I'm going to try to explain it. Gray rocking is basically when you're dealing with a narcissist, or let's say a person who has a very difficult personality, because narcissists are, I think they fall into something called the dark triad, which includes narcissism, sociopathy, psychopathy. I think Machiavellianism as well is falling into that category. So these people who are extremely difficult, power hungry, aggressive, whatever. And what you see is that people who are very Saturn dominant are very good at handling these kinds of individuals by basically doing what I know Dr. Ramani at least referred to as gray rocking, which is basically a fancy way of saying playing dead. Gray rocking means mastering the art of non-reactivity against a person, because narcissists especially, and psychopaths, they get off on the sense of power that they get when they annoy a person, let's say, or when they instigate anger, or or when they start conflict, right? So instead, what Saturnians do, they're very good at just acting like they don't care, and I'm talking down to the details. I'm not just talking about, not saying anything provocative or being careful to not express their opinions. That's like first level, but Saturnians take it down all the way to controlling every little micro expression of their face to the point where they act like robots. And I've actually mentioned this even in the previous video where I talked about Teal Swan. She's very good at this, right? I mean, and you see this time and again with politicians. Barack Obama also has Saturn, Jupiter conjunct in the first house. And he's very good at playing dead. I mean, and you often see this with people with Saturn dominant. And here's the thing. They are very good at showing this kind of a blank stare sort of face that nothing phases them. And they're also even controlling their tonality, their tone of voice, and the way they talk, the way they speak, like don't show any kind of emotional inflections of any kind, because it makes them sound more, in control and more mature and somehow more worthy of being listened to. And in fact, I'm not going to take it so far, but a lot of the times, and I have talked about this also in the video where I talked about narcissism and psychopathy and all this, that oftentimes people who are Saturn dominant can even show psychopathy. They can show psychopathy, sociopathy, you can see pathological liars who are very Saturn dominant. But again, a lot does depend on individual configurations as well. Oftentimes, and the funny thing is, you're going to see this when I get to the examples that I have, that you want to see a very strong Saturn, but a lot of the times it's also a very damaged Saturn that produces these kinds of individuals, so Saturn debilitated in Aries, for instance, it can produce a person who is focused on using deception as a way to get everything that they want. Because normally a healthy Saturn will make a person very patient, very hardworking, so even if they can still be very materialistic and very focused on results and they don't care about feelings and anything like that. So they can be extremely materialistic, Saturnians, and they will not prioritize authenticity, for instance, above social success and validation. Because Saturn, there's a reason why Saturn rules Capricorn in the 10th house, right? Saturn is all about social status and the security that comes with social status and going in line with society, not against it, right? So this is why you're not going to see Saturnians ready to make waves or to focus too much on being themselves. Instead, they're going to be way more focused on telling people what they want to hear and, presenting themselves in a way that is socially acceptable and makes them likable, or at the very least makes them not a target of all kinds of contradictory discussions and controversies and whatnot. They will do that to their best abilities. And of course, again, a lot depends on what else is going on in the horoscope. So these are pretty much the main things that I want to say. Overemphasis on materialism, a tendency towards deception, a tendency to not care about feelings. And this goes hand in hand with materialism. And you see this with, oftentimes when you see Saturn, let's say, aspecting the moon, conjunct the moon, or the ascendant, to be fair, it's also that these people were not shown a lot of affection when they were growing up, so they are grown in an environment that is very emotionally barren. There's a lot of coldness, there's not a lot of lovey-dovey stuff. They can get the message from an early age that their emotions don't matter, right? That they need to suck it up and be mature, quote unquote, which of course is abusive, because children should be allowed to have feelings and parents should not, reprimand their kids for showing basic human emotion. But a lot of parents are not healthy, as we know, and a lot of parents, as you see from people's horoscopes, I've talked about this again in multiple videos, that you look at people's horoscopes and you see these placements, and the Saturn dominant placements go hand in hand with this. They show abusive childhoods. I've also mentioned this in the video where I talked about bad childhoods, right? Certain placements. Not every Saturnian is going to have like some kind of a bad childhood. But generally when you see Saturn, especially aspecting the moon, connected to the second house, the fourth house, because these are the houses of the early family environment, you can see an environment that was actually very barren and without warmth emotionally, and sometimes even, marked by material struggles and poverty, So it could be that the child just didn't feel safe because their parents were constantly struggling financially, and everyone was just focused on staying alive and being fed and clothed. And so there was no time or energy for fun or, showing affection or any of this stuff. But whatever the situation may be, the results often show that Saturnian-dominant people, Saturnian people or Saturn-dominant people can display some of these negative traits of deception, of overly focused on control, materialism, and basically caring about social status above everything else, So this is pretty much what I wanted to say, and now let me get into the examples that I've come across. The first one that was the most telling, maybe, was Andrew Tate. I'm not surprised whatsoever. And actually, I was going to say this, that Saturnians, this is why they can't be involved in criminal activities, because this mentality of the world owes me something, or, I have been born in an underprivileged environment, gives them this kind of feeling like they're justified to behave in a way that is very antisocial, that is, somehow like they have an excuse for, not caring about other people because when they were growing up, nobody cared about them, This is why it's amazing how there is such a strong correlation between astrological placements and psychology and how a person develops psychologically. Now, I don't know much about Andrew Tate's background, but just looking at his horoscope, he has Moon, Saturn, and Sun conjunct in Scorpio. All right, so already we have Moon here is debilitated in Scorpio, and he has Saturn and Sun conjuncted as well. So this shows a person who definitely has this very Saturnian energy. So this could definitely have shown a mother who was maybe not physically absent, but not particularly affectionate, didn't care. Saturn shows a lot of hardship. There could have been a lot of material hardships for him growing up. The time of birth is not known, so I can't get too much into detail. Who knows, maybe this configuration would have been even more prominent if you knew the time of birth. Maybe it happens in the first house, who knows. But in any case, already having Saturn conjunct the Moon and the Sun in Scorpio kind of really, the Moon there is really hemmed between two malefics, which shows that the way of thinking, the mentality is messed up here, and the emotional nature as well, because Saturn, like I said, shows a kind of coldness and barrenness. So when it's connected to the Moon, it can show like I said, so lack of affection from the early life environment, a mother that was maybe too preoccupied, maybe abandoned even. Although generally with Saturn, it doesn't show abandonment. That's more of Ketu's. Actually, funny enough, he also has Ketu aspecting the Moon. So he has, wait, let me check. No, he doesn't have Ketu. He has Rahu aspecting the Moon. So he has Rahu in Pisces aspecting the Moon by 9th aspect as well. So that would give it also that extra desire for materialism, because Rahu amplifies everything that it touches. And when Rahu is aspecting the Moon, it gives that very strong desire for material success, And So, I think this is enough, really, to explain, maybe not his entire pathology, because the guy does sound like a psychopath, honestly. So, unfortunately, he really embodies all of these negative Saturnian traits that I have talked about. Let me see if there's anything else going on here. So, let's see. 7, 8... Another thing that I see is he has Mars aspecting Ketu by 8th aspect. And you might think this is a relatively minor aspect, but I have also mentioned this exactly in the previous video where I talked about Rahu Ketu and what makes people famous, that contact between Mars and Ketu can make a person pretty thoughtless, like throwing themselves headfirst into doing things, which actually contradicts the Saturnian energy. So it's interesting here because he managed to fool people long enough to believe that he was, you know, some innocent victim of injustice. And ironically, he was actually addressing, you know, a segment of the population that kind of had this victim mentality of, oh my God, men are so oppressed, right? When you think about it. To be honest, I hadn't even heard of Andrew Tate until he was basically banned. But I found out that he had this huge following, and now he has basically been accused of human trafficking, and there's a lot of evidence that he is a total psychopath, actually. I mean, recorded evidence and everything that he abused women to make his fortune, and he was actually trying to teach men how to do the same thing, you know? And you can clearly see from his self-righteousness that he thought, you know, this is not a big deal. Like, and, you know, again, I am stretching here a little bit because I don't know what his family history is, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has some kind of background of being poor, underprivileged, and I don't know, maybe has some mommy issues going on, because with this moon situation, definitely the mother figure has not been the most helpful. So it makes sense. And oh, by the way, also the moon is in Anuradha Nakshatra as well. I'm pretty sure. Let me check again. Yeah, Anuradha Nakshatra. The moon, the sun, and Saturn are in Anuradha Nakshatra, which again is more Saturn energy because Anuradha is ruled by Saturn. Yeah, pretty much. What can I say? Great example in the negative. Another example that I wanted to talk about is Epstein. What's his name? Jeffrey Epstein. Now, to be fair, Jeffrey Epstein, let me see. Again, ascended in Anuradha, I'm pretty sure. Ascended, let me see. 2 degrees, Sagittarius tropical. Let me check. Yes, ascendant in Anuradha. I already could tell, honestly, from his elongated face, that oftentimes Saturnians have this elongated sort of face, especially the distance from the nose to the chin. In fact, Justin Bieber also has ascendant in Anuradha, and he has the same elongated sort of chin. In any case, details. So what I wanted to say here about Epstein, the funny thing about Epstein is that he actually really matches everything that I talked about, because I saw a documentary, I mean, years ago after the whole scandal with his, you know, pedophilic trafficking ring that also involved the British royalty, that he actually really fitted this profile of someone who came from a poor background and sought to basically join the ranks of the rich and famous by any means necessary, right? It kind of actually reminds me, I mean, the Saturnian energy actually reminds me of Epstein, now that I think about it, reminds me of the character of Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. You know that line where he's like, I realized that I wasn't good at fighting, so I'm not gonna fight them, I'm gonna fuck them. Pardon my French. And by the way, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, Littlefinger was this conniving, scheming, you know, I don't know, destroyer of worlds who was basically, who was also a brothel owner, among other things, and he was very good at scheming and, you know, plotting from the shadows and keeping people fighting with one another. So that's a great example of the negative Saturnian aspect. So, yeah, what I was going to say about Epstein as well is not just that he has ascendant in Anuradha, but he also has Saturn, let's see, exalted. Saturn is exalted in Libra. And Saturn is, let's see, aspecting his Mercury by 3rd aspect. But that's, okay, and these are not catastrophic aspects that would suggest the person going bad. I think I checked, let me check again. Yeah, when you look at his Navamsa, he has Saturn in the 3rd house. So Saturn is very happy in the 3rd house because this shows a lot of effort being put towards his endeavors, and it's a malefic in a malefic house, basically. This is a really good placement for success. Saturn is in Scorpio here, so it's also very strong because it's basically falling in Anuradha Nakshatra. Again, very strong Anuradha going on here. And another thing is, let me see, Saturn is, let me check. Yeah, this is what's going on in his Navamsa. To be fair, Epstein also has other things going on that show the insanity here. Among other things, he has Venus and Mars conjunct in Aquarius. Oh no. Let me check. 15, 16. I'm pretty sure this is Purva Bhadrapada. No, one of them is in Shatabhisha and the other one is in Purva Bhadrapada. Yeah, Venus is in Purva Bhadrapada. Mars is in Shatabhisha Nakshatra. I've actually talked about this in the Shatabhisha or Shatabhisha, or again, I'm still not 100% sure how to pronounce it, as I said in that video. This Nakshatra is connected to a lot of suffering and a lot of pain. So, and it's also, in his case, it's the ascendant ruler as well, because he has ascendant in Scorpio. So it's one of the ascendant rulers because he committed suicide, quote unquote. In any case, I've said this in that video, that people with Mars in Shatabhisha, in fact, Casanova, the famous Italian playboy, had Mars in Shatabhisha, I'm pretty sure, or Jupiter. I think he had Mars conjunct Jupiter, and one of them was in Shatabhisha. And I mentioned in that video that it could show some kind of complex connected to sexuality and masculinity. Especially for men who have Mars in Shatabhisha, because for men, Mars is much more connected to their sexuality. For women, it's more Venus, and to some extent also the moon. But with men, Mars can signify, virility, and it's kind of like this active chasing sort of part of sexuality. So when it's connected to Shatabhisha, it can show some huge complexes going on there. Maybe connected to virility or his manlyhood or whatever the hell was going on there. Also, what you notice is, since we are talking about messed up people and sad childhoods, is that Mars and Venus conjunction falls in the 4th house, which is the house of the early childhood, the mother, whatever. So there could have been violence going on there. Since you have Mars and Venus conjunct, also Hitler had this conjunction, by the way, and I'm not trying to say that everyone who has this is going to be violent towards women, but that is one potential expression of this, especially with these rather heavy nakshatras here. Venus in Purva Bhadrapada. This is really interesting here with Venus in Purva Bhadrapada. I don't think this guy was married. I'm pretty sure. I remember seeing a documentary, which doesn't surprise me here, because Venus in Purva Bhadrapada can show that the person attracts very powerful women, women who are, could make a man feel, insecure, so to speak. It's kind of complicated for me to even explain this, but I have mentioned this in other videos, and you may know this from other places, that the Venus represents the wife archetype in a man's horoscope. So what I have seen actually a lot is that men who have strong Venus, and when I say strong, I'm talking about nakshatras or placements around Venus that suggest attracting powerful women, women who are very headstrong, independent, difficult to control. These men actually have a lot of resentment towards women. And in his case, it's even more so because it's connected to the 4th house, which is the mother archetype. So it could even be that the mother figure somehow was this very strong woman. He may have seen some weird power struggles happening between his parents. Maybe his father tried to dominate his mother, or the other way around, and somehow that marked him. I'm just going out on a limb here. I don't know about his childhood much. But any case, this is not directly connected to Saturn. Something else that you see is that his Rahu is falling in Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, which is interesting. And it's also falling in the 3rd house. That's really interesting because it shows a really exaggerated ambition and a very strong, daring sort of energy. Let me check. Another thing, and another thing is that you see Saturn opposite his Jupiter, which again affects the mentalities of the person. See, Jupiter with Saturn can show a person, again, who is very dominated by Saturnian mentalities, which is thinking about limitations and how discriminated you are and how, poor me, all this stuff, like I can play the victim card, or and again, goes hand in hand with what I said. The main trait of Saturnians gone bad is that they have this mentality of, well, I was discriminated against, or I grew up in an environment of poverty, therefore I get a free pass at using deception and all kinds of abusive methods to get what I want in life. Yeah, pretty much this is what I wanted to say about Epstein. And let me check. Another one is Weinstein, because we are in the same categories here. Men who are very abusive. Well, with Weinstein, again, I would say this was not the most prominent thing in his horoscope. But he also had Saturn opposite, I think he's still alive. Saturn opposite the sun. This could have shown some kind of power struggles with the father as well. Although I'm not trying to say opposite the sun, also opposite again Mercury and Jupiter. Here we have it again. Jupiter is being touched by Saturn. So there could have been, again, some kind of mentalities connected to this idea of being discriminated, not being seen, being marginalized, having this kind of outsider mentality. And you also see, what you see kind of really disturbingly in Weinstein's case is that he has Venus conjunct Rahu, again, in Shatabhisha Nakshatra. This time, see, Venus is, again, the wife archetype connected to Rahu. Men who have this Venus-Rahu conjunction, best case scenario, not the best case scenario, actually. But generally, men who have this conjunction can be womanizers, because Rahu expands everything that it touches. So Venus shows women in general, or the wife archetype. So having Rahu conjunct Venus can show that you never get tired of women. Like, you need constant variety of women, and you just want a lot of partners. To some extent, this can also be true for women, but to a much lesser degree than it is for men. Because for men in particular, the Venus archetype is the wife. And it also happens in Shatabhisha Nakshatra again, which can show some pain. Obviously, there was pain because eventually he ended up in prison. But maybe a lot of the BS that he was doing, not trying to justify it, maybe came from some kind of a mentality of like, I'm never going to have the woman that I want or the partner that I want, because there's some kind of pain connected to this Venus Rahu conjunction because it falls in Shatabhisha Nakshatra. And again, this is not directly connected to Saturn, but, as I said, you have to look at the full picture because everything plays a part, right? It's not like every person who has Sun opposite Saturn is going to play out the negative expression of this aspect. There are usually other parts of the chart that kind of, give it more momentum and push the person in the way of evil deeds. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about probably the most... Wait. One more. Before I get to the last one, I want to talk about Charles Ponzi. He was the famous schemer, fraudulent person after which the famous Ponzi scheme term has been coined. This guy, okay, he was born in 1882, but I have looked at his horoscope. He has Saturn in the 7th house, conjunct Jupiter. Oh my God. Again, conjunct Jupiter. Let me see. Ascendant, Libra, and 7th house is falling in Aries. So he has Saturn and Jupiter conjunct in Aries. Had in the 7th house. So very prominent Saturn energy here. And also had Moon in Magha, which of course would have added to him becoming notorious. Speaking of notoriety, since I was talking about notoriety in the previous horoscope, let me check something out. Let me check what else is going on here that may have shown notoriety. And alright, so he had 10th house in Cancer. And the moon is falling in Leo. All right, moon in the 11th house, actually. So that could have shown a lot of gains. I mean, definitely a lot of gains, at least temporarily, from scheming. But the moon is aspected by Mercury, by Sun, and Venus. So we have aspects to the 10th house lord by the lords of the 12th, 8th, 12th, 8th, and already that's more than enough because I wanted to check if there's the 12th or the 8th. I was looking for where the other houses that Mercury and Venus rule are. So we have the 8th house. Yeah, the first house. Oh, okay. So the lords of the first house, the 8th house, and the 9th house. All right, but in any case, the lords of the 8th and the 12th houses are aspecting the lord of the 10th. So that shows loss of reputation, loss of fame. Obviously, I haven't checked his transits and his mahadashas to see when this happened because you probably would have seen a correlation there. But just as a fun fact, not directly related to the topic of today, but I have talked about fame recently, so I thought it would be interesting to check. In any case, the man had strong Saturn influence again with Jupiter, which definitely influences the belief system of a person. You know, can really make Jupiter go bad here. And last but not least, okay, I have saved the best for last. That's what I'm trying to say, is this guy called Andrew Cunanan, who was the murderer. First of all, he was basically a serial killer because he killed multiple men. I think about 5 men in total, but he was most famous for killing Gianni Versace in, I think, 1997. Yeah, 1997, after which he committed suicide. He committed suicide a few days after he killed Versace. And his horoscope is very telling. First of all, I have found an article about him. I will be linking it in the video description if you're curious, because it really just goes hand in hand with a lot of the things that I wanted to say about Saturnians. And I have already mentioned in this video, which is that he did come from not necessarily an impoverished background, but he came from a background where he felt discriminated against. So just to read a little bit from this article, so he was born as the youngest of 4 kids to a Navy veteran turned stockbroker, and this woman whose profession is not mentioned, maybe she was a housewife, and he was basically very intelligent from a young age. At the age of 10, he memorized some encyclopedia, and he had an IQ of 147. He was very smart for his age, and he was attending a private school at which where most of the other students came from families that were wealthier than his. This is what the article says. So, in order to fit in, Cunanan made up stories about his background, which has led many to believe that he showed early signs of antisocial personality disorder, previously referred to as psychopathy or sociopathy. Oh, okay, so now it's no longer called that. Okay. Cunanan would even change his appearance throughout school according to what he felt was most attractive at the time. Later in life, Cunanan would claim that his father was an Israeli millionaire and a Fifth Avenue aristocrat. Very interesting, okay, because he was the only one of his siblings, again from the article, to attend a prestigious and expensive private school. He was the father's pride and joy, according to his brother. Now, if we look at his horoscope, now I'm not going to put these horoscopes up because you can easily find them with Google searches, so yeah. But you can easily see where this is coming from. So we have Saturn conjunct Moon and ascendant in Aries, actually in Bharani Nakshatra, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I'm not trying to say that Bharani has some connection with him becoming a murderer. But Bharani is interesting. This combination actually is interesting for multiple reasons, because first of all, the moon is not happy in Aries. Moon in Bharani is a pretty painful placement. Actually, it's not even in Bharani. Wait, let me check again. Yes, his moon is in Bharani, actually. Let me check. 9. Yeah, his moon was in Bharani. Saturn was in Ashwini, Nakshatra. And the moon in Bharani in Aries is not the happiest placement for the moon, but of course that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who has moon in Bharani is going to be a killer. But already we see the connection between moon and Saturn and the ascendant, right? So it's like the double threat here, like of Saturn being connected to the life path and also the moon. And Bharani is also an energy that very much seeks pleasures and can have a bit of a dark side. Also in this article, it mentions at some point that he was involved in dark pornography and that I should have said something else. I don't know. Can I say it? Anyway, I just said it. Pornography, okay. And also he was got addicted to a life of luxury by depending on basically rich sugar daddies, and this is why he ended up murdering, actually, before he murdered Versace, he murdered some other wealthy guy, so he kind of moved in these circles of, elites, where he was probably living as kind of a sugar baby, pretty boy, and he was gay, yeah. And what was I going to say? Yeah, so we have this conjunction here between Saturn, Moon, and Ascendant, which really, really explains it and goes hand in hand with what is said about his childhood and his early life. Let me check another thing, actually. 7, yeah. Saturn is in Aries. Saturn is also aspecting Venus by 10th aspect. And Venus is falling in, let me check, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, the 4th house. All right. Yeah, so this is a really interesting example because this person doesn't come from a background of abuse. All right. But what he does come from is a background where he felt probably discriminated against, and he clearly had a desire for materialism and success because of all these Bharani placements. The Venus in the 4th house would suggest that he had a relatively good childhood, good connection with the family of origin, which matches what the articles say, that he was basically the father's pride and joy. So, but there was a rift with the family once they discovered that he was gay. According to the article, he moved out, and basically, I mean, he had already started partying and getting involved with, the gay clubbing scene and all this stuff. And once they found out that he was gay, he moved out. Probably, I mean, it doesn't 100% say in the article, but probably because he wanted a life of luxury and he knew that he could get it by relying on his looks. He was also not particularly bad looking, as you would as you would expect for someone who was basically living as a sugar baby. You definitely see this strong desire here, strong materialistic desire, and this focus on luxury above everything else, and according to the article, even, he is described as a psychopath, or as they call it, antisocial personality, because he was a pathological liar. He started lying to attract attention and to basically fit in. So really, really it matched. I was so psyched when, I came across this example, because I vaguely remembered about the guy who killed Versace, and then I did some more research to see the details about his life, because I wondered if maybe he had some strong Saturn placement, because I remembered actually that he had a debilitated Saturn, and that's another thing that I wanted to say. He had Saturn in Aries, which is debilitated. And that would mean, and I've seen this a lot with people who have Saturn debilitated. And again, I'm not trying to say that they're all going to turn psychopaths and killers, but generally when Saturn is debilitated or afflicted, it can show people who don't want to work hard, you know, because Saturn is normally about putting up with obstacles, putting up with frustrations, you know, being patient, taking things step by step, you know, putting in the effort day after day, night after night, and knowing that eventually you will start to see results. But when Saturn is not healthy in a horoscope, like I said, debilitated or aspected by malefics or both, you see people who want to try to cut corners, you know, and this particular aspect is, in this horoscope, it's really interesting that he doesn't have any strong Rahu energy either. So it wouldn't explain, so Rahu is not really influencing, you know, this hyper desire for materialism anymore. It's mostly Saturn. Another thing that I can say, though, is that he also has Ketu conjunct the sun, which would explain, you know, being irrational, throwing yourself headfirst, again, committing even thoughtless actions, in this case, really to the point of murder, and doing things without thinking things through, and without thinking about the consequences. That would fall hand in hand with the Ketu energy. And again, I mentioned Ketu in the previous video about fame as well. Yeah, because Ketu was prominent in the horoscopes of people who were great military leaders, for instance, in the past. I'm pretty sure that Alexander the Great also had Ketu conjunct Sun. I'm pretty sure that Caesar also had Ketu conjunct Sun, and Joan of Arc also had Ketu conjunct Mars. I've talked about this extensively in the previous video about fame in the horoscope, and again, I will be linking that if you want to find out more about it. How I explained that basically in the past, people who would throw themselves headfirst and, you know, were able to let go of common sense and their fears would gain fame oftentimes, especially in military circles or circumstances. So, yeah, this is pretty much what I can say here about Andrew Cunanan, and this is the last of my examples. So, if you have found this video interesting, once again, remember that I'm not trying to bash people who are Saturn dominant, as I mentioned in the beginning. I'm just trying to explain some of the potential negative pitfalls of the energy of Saturn, how it can go bad and how it can really make people become destructive in different ways. So yes, if you have found this video helpful, interesting, useful, and you would like to see more content from me, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel if you want to, and also click on the notifications bell if you want to see when I will upload a new video. Also, please comment in the comment section with any feedback you would like to give and maybe ideas for future videos that you have. And also, if you're interested in the membership options, you can click the join button to find out more details about the different membership options that I have. And if you're interested in a private tarot reading, you can email me at the email address in the video description. Sorry, not tarot reading, actually tarot and astrology readings. You can email me at the email address in the video descriptions. And also, last but not least, I have a tarot channel, and I will be linking it in the video description as well as in the pinned comment. So if you're curious about tarot, go ahead and check it out. Maybe subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you, and I hope to see you at my next video.